I corrected a duke in front of his guests, and in that single moment of defiance, I sealed my fate forever. What I did not know then was that fate had two faces, and one of them would teach me how to love again. My name is Eleanor Ashford, and I was not always a maid. There was a time when I sat in a sunlit study in Cambridge, my fingers tracing the pages of Homer while my father read aloud in Greek, his voice rising and falling like music. He was Professor William Ashford, a man whose brilliance was matched only by his poverty, and he loved me with a devotion that I did not fully understand until he was gone. My mother had died giving me life, and so my father became everything to me. He taught me Latin before I learned to braid my own hair. He taught me French, while other girls learned needlework. He gave me languages the way other fathers gave their daughters dowries, believing, perhaps foolishly, that knowledge would be my inheritance. But knowledge does not pay debts. And when my father collapsed in his study one gray November morning, his heart surrendering to years of overwork and worry, I discovered that he had left me nothing but books and creditors. The men who came to collect what was owed showed no mercy to a grieving daughter. They took everything: the furniture my mother had chosen, the piano she had played, the books my father had spent a lifetime collecting. I watched strangers carry away my entire world in wooden crates, and when they were finished, I stood alone in an empty house with nothing but the clothes I wore, and a small leather bag containing my father's spectacles, a lock of my mother's hair, and a worn copy of Virgil's Aeneid that I had hidden beneath my skirts. I was 23 years old. I had no family. I had no prospects. And I had been raised in a world that had no place for a woman with education and no fortune. The only path left to me was the one I had been taught to believe was beneath me, and so I swallowed my pride like bitter medicine and sought employment as a domestic servant. I will not pretend that the transition was easy. My hands, which had turned pages of ancient texts, now scrubbed floors and polished silver. My voice, which had recited Ovid and debated philosophy with my father's colleagues, now spoke only when spoken to, and even then, only to say yes, ma'am, and no, sir. I learned to make myself invisible, to move through grand houses like a ghost, to keep my eyes lowered and my thoughts hidden. I learned that in the eyes of the aristocracy, a servant was not quite a person. We were furniture that happened to breathe. I worked in 3 houses over the course of 2 years. The first dismissed me when the lady of the house discovered I could read better than her own daughter. The second let me go when the household downsized after a financial scandal. The third was kind enough, but the elderly widow I served passed away peacefully in her sleep, and her son, upon inheriting the estate, brought his own staff from London. Each time I found myself without a position, I felt the ground beneath me grow more unstable, as if I were walking on ice that grew thinner with every step. It was Mrs. Blackwood, the housekeeper at Ashworth Manor, who finally offered me a permanent position. She was a stern woman with gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her face, but her eyes were not unkind. She looked at my references, asked me a few questions about my experience, and then studied me with an expression I could not read. "You speak well for a maid," she said. I lowered my gaze. "I was fortunate to receive some education as a child, ma'am." She made a sound that might have been approval or suspicion. "The Duke does not tolerate foolishness. He values silence and efficiency." "Can you provide both?" "Yes, ma'am." "Then you may begin tomorrow. You will work primarily in the East Wing, maintaining the library and the private study. The Duke spends most of his time there. You will clean when he is not present, and you will make yourself scarce when he is. Is that understood?" "Yes, ma'am." The agency that placed me at Ashworth Manor was run by a pinched-faced woman named Mrs. Hargrove, who looked at my references with undisguised suspicion and asked me 3 times if I was certain I had no family who could take me in. When I assured her that I did not, she sighed heavily, as if my orphaned state were a personal inconvenience, and told me that she had one position available. It was in Yorkshire, she said, in a great house that had difficulty keeping staff. The work was hard, the master was cold, and the location was remote. but the pay was fair, and the housekeeper was said to be reasonable. I took the position without hesitation. I had learned, by then, that beggars could not be choosers, and that any roof over my head was better than none. The journey to Yorkshire took 3 days by coach, through rain and mud and countryside that grew increasingly wild as we traveled north. I shared the coach with a merchant's wife who talked incessantly about her daughter's upcoming wedding, a clergyman who snored through most of the journey, and an elderly woman who knitted in silence and occasionally gave me sympathetic looks, as if she could sense the weight of loss that I carried with me. I did not speak to any of them beyond the necessary pleasantries. I had learned to guard my words as carefully as I guarded my heart. When I finally arrived at the village nearest to Ashworth Manor, the rain had stopped and the sky had cleared to reveal a landscape of stark, windswept beauty. The moors stretched in every direction, purple with heather, and in the distance, I could see the silhouette of a great house perched on a hill, its towers reaching toward the clouds like fingers grasping for something just out of reach. A cart was waiting to take me the final miles to the estate, driven by a taciturn man who answered my attempts at conversation with grunts and monosyllables. I gave up after the first quarter hour and simply watched the landscape unfold around me, feeling smaller and smaller as the great house grew larger and larger on the horizon. And so I came to Ashworth Manor, a sprawling estate in the countryside of Yorkshire that seemed to exist outside of time itself. The house was magnificent and melancholy, with towering windows that let in pale gray light and endless corridors that echoed with the footsteps of the living and, I sometimes imagined, the whispers of the dead. It had been the seat of the Ashworth family for generations, and it wore its history like a heavy cloak. Portraits of ancestors lined the walls, their painted eyes following me as I passed. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings so high they seemed to touch the clouds. And everywhere, there was silence. The Duke of Ashworth was Theodore Ashworth, the fifth of his name, and he was everything the servants whispered about during our brief moments of rest. He was 31 years old, tall and lean, with dark hair that he wore slightly longer than fashion dictated, and eyes the color of winter storms. He moved through his own house like a man haunted by something he refused to name, his expression perpetually guarded, his manner cold as marble. The other servants spoke of him in hushed tones, as if even saying his name too loudly might summon his displeasure. He was married once. Lily, one of the kitchen maids, told me during my first week, to Lady Catherine Pembroke. Beautiful woman, they say. But she died just a year after the wedding. Some say childbirth, though there was no child that survived. Others say it was a fever. Whatever it was, it changed him. He used to smile, they say. Used to host grand parties and ride out with the hunting parties. Now he just sits in that library of his, surrounded by his books, and speaks to no one unless he must. I listened to these stories with the detachment I had cultivated over my years in service. The personal lives of my employers were not my concern. I was there to dust and polish and disappear, and that was precisely what I intended to do. But I would be lying if I said I was not curious about the man who had locked himself away with his grief and his books, the man who had made a fortress of his own heart. I saw him for the first time on my third day at Ashworth Manor. I had been sent to the library to prepare it for his afternoon study, and I had been assured that he would not arrive until 2 o'clock. It was 1:30 when I slipped through the heavy oak doors, my cleaning supplies in hand, expecting to find the room empty. Instead, I found him. He was standing by the window, his back to me, his silhouette framed by the pale light that filtered through the glass. He held a book in one hand, and he was so still that for a moment I thought he might be a statue, some elaborate piece of art that I had somehow failed to notice before. But then he turned, and his eyes met mine, and I felt something shift in the air between us, something I could not name. He was handsome in a severe way, all sharp angles and shadows, but it was not his appearance that struck me most. It was the way he looked at me, or rather, through me, as if I were a pane of glass and he was searching for something on the other side. There was no warmth in that gaze, no curiosity, only a kind of tired dismissal, as if my presence was an inconvenience he had learned to tolerate. "You are the new maid," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, Your Grace." I curtsied, keeping my eyes on the floor. "I apologize for the intrusion. I was told you would not be using the library until 2. I changed my mind. I will return later, Your Grace." I turned to leave, but his voice stopped me. "Wait." I froze, my heart suddenly pounding for reasons I did not understand. Slowly, I turned back to face him, my gaze still carefully lowered. "What is your name?" "Eleanor, Your Grace." "Eleanor Ashford." "Ashford." He repeated the name slowly, as if tasting it. "An unusual name for a maid." "It is my father's name, Your Grace." He was a schoolteacher. The lie came easily. I had told it so many times that it almost felt true. A schoolteacher was respectable enough to explain my education, but humble enough to explain my current circumstances. It was the story I had crafted for myself, the mask I wore to hide the truth of who I had been. The Duke said nothing more. He simply turned back to his window and his book, and I understood that I had been dismissed. I slipped out of the library as quietly as I had entered, and I did not breathe properly until I was safely in the servants' corridor, alone with my racing thoughts. That was my first encounter with Theodore Ashworth, and I told myself it would also be my last significant one. I would do my work. I would remain invisible. I would give him no reason to notice me, and he would give me no reason to think of him. It was a simple plan, a safe plan, and for several weeks, it worked perfectly. I cleaned the library in the early morning hours before he rose, and again in the late evening, after he retired to his chambers. I learned his schedule and arranged my duties around it, becoming a shadow that passed through his world without ever touching it. I dusted his books with a reverence that surprised me, running my fingers over spines written in Latin and Greek and French, recognizing titles my father had taught me to love. Sometimes, when I was certain I was alone, I would open a volume and read a few lines, just to remind myself of who I used to be. But I always closed the book quickly, carefully, leaving no trace of my presence. The library was his sanctuary, and I was merely its caretaker. But sanctuaries, I was about to learn, can become battlegrounds. It happened on a Thursday evening in late autumn, when the sky outside had turned the color of bruises and rain lashed against the windows like a living thing. The Duke was hosting a small dinner party, a rare occurrence that had the entire household in a state of nervous activity. His guests were 3 gentlemen from London, old friends from his university days, and they had arrived that afternoon with trunks of expensive luggage and an air of easy privilege that set my teeth on edge. I had observed them from a distance as they arrived, their loud voices and confident laughter echoing through the entrance hall. They greeted the Duke with backslaps and jests, the easy camaraderie of men who had known each other in youth and assumed that friendship transcended all other considerations. Theodore received them with a warmth that surprised me. I had never seen him so animated, so willing to engage in the kind of idle social chatter that he usually avoided. "They are from his Oxford days," Lily whispered to me as we watched from the servants' staircase. "Lord Edward Blackwell, Sir James Morton, and Mr. William Crane. They visit every year about this time. The Duke is always different when they are here, almost like his old self, before the Duchess died. Their presence in the house changed its atmosphere entirely. The quiet, contemplative mood that usually prevailed gave way to something louder and more chaotic. The gentlemen drank port in the drawing room, played billiards late into the night, and filled the corridors with their booming voices and hearty laughter. The servants scurried to meet their demands, and I found myself working longer hours than usual, polishing silver and preparing rooms and generally trying to stay out of the way. I was not supposed to be in the library that evening. The dinner was being held in the formal dining room, and I had been assigned to help with the clearing of courses, but one of the footmen had fallen ill, genuinely ill, and not simply avoiding work as the servants sometimes did when the demands became too great. Mrs. Blackwood had sent me to the library to light the fire and prepare the room for after-dinner drinks. I was to complete the task quickly and then disappear, as I always did. The fire took longer to catch than I had expected. The wood was damp, perhaps, or the draft in the chimney was not drawing properly. I knelt on the hearth, coaxing the flames with patience I did not feel, acutely aware that time was passing and that the gentlemen would finish their meal soon. I had just managed to get a proper blaze going when I heard voices in the corridor. Male voices, loud with wine and laughter. Before I could rise from my knees, the door swung open and the Duke entered with his 3 guests. I scrambled to my feet, my heart lurching into my throat. I curtsied deeply, keeping my eyes on the floor, praying that they would not notice me, that I could slip past them and escape into the safety of the servants' passage. But luck, it seemed, had abandoned me. "Ah," one of the guests said, his voice carrying the lazy drawl of a man who had never known a moment of hardship. "Who is this pretty little thing?" I felt my cheeks burn with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. I curtsied again, still not looking up. "I am just a maid, sir. I was preparing the fire. I will leave you to your evening." "Nonsense," another guest said. "Stay a moment. We could use some entertainment. Tell me, girl, can you read?" The question was meant to mock. I could hear it in his tone, see it in the way the others chuckled. They expected me to stammer, to blush, to confirm their assumptions about the limitations of the lower classes. They expected me to be exactly what they believed I was: ignorant, simple, beneath their notice. I should have said no. I should have played the part I had been playing for years, the part that kept me safe. But something in me, some stubborn flame that my father had kindled long ago, refused to be extinguished. "Yes, sir," I said quietly. "I can read." The room went silent for a moment, and then the first guest laughed. "She can read," he says. "How delightful. Can you read Latin, girl? Or is that beyond your capabilities?" I did not answer. I could not. To admit that I knew Latin would be to expose myself, to raise questions I could not afford to answer. So I simply stood there, my hands clasped before me, my gaze fixed on the floor. It was the Duke who spoke next, and his voice was different from the others. Colder, sharper, like a blade being drawn from its sheath. "Leave her alone, Edward," he said. "She is a servant, not a circus performer." I should have felt grateful for his intervention. Instead, I felt something else, something that took me a moment to identify. It was pity. He was defending me not out of respect, but out of the same dismissive condescension that had driven his friends to mock me. To him, I was a creature too simple to be worth tormenting, a dog that should not be kicked only because it did not know any better. The guest called Edward raised his hands in mock surrender. "Very well, very well. No offense meant. But since you mention it, Theodore, I have been meaning to ask you about that passage in Virgil we were discussing earlier. The one from the Aeneid. You quoted it at dinner, but I believe you made an error." The Duke's expression flickered. A brief flash of something that might have been irritation. "I made no error. You said," Edward continued, clearly enjoying himself, "Forsan et haec olim meminisse juvabit." But surely the correct phrasing is, "Forsan et haec olim meminis juvabit." He pronounced the words with exaggerated care, looking around at the others as if expecting applause for his erudition. The Duke's jaw tightened. "That is exactly what I said." "No, no," Edward insisted. "You used the future tense incorrectly. Juvabit should be pronounced with the emphasis on the second syllable, not the third. It is a common mistake among those who learned their Latin from books rather than proper tutors." The other guests murmured in agreement, and I watched as the Duke's face hardened. He was not wrong. The pronunciation was correct. But Edward was attempting to embarrass him, to assert dominance in that petty way that men of privilege so often employed. And the Duke, for all his coldness, was losing. I should have stayed silent. I should have let them have their foolish argument and slipped away unnoticed. But my father's voice was in my head, as clear as if he were standing beside me. "Never let ignorance win, Ellie. Never let them rewrite what is true. and so I spoke. "If I may, sir." The words left my mouth before I could stop them. Every head in the room turned toward me. The Duke's eyes, gray and cold, fixed on my face with an intensity that made my breath catch. Edward laughed. "The maid wishes to contribute to our Latin debate. By all means, girl, enlighten us." I should have backed down. I should have apologized and fled. But it was too late. The words were already forming on my tongue, and there was no calling them back. "The Duke's pronunciation was correct, sir," I said, my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands. "Juvabit is indeed future active indicative, and the emphasis naturally falls on the penultimate syllable due to the length of the A. Furthermore, if you wish to correct his grammar, you might note that the full line, as Virgil wrote it, is forsan et haec olim meminisse juvabit, with the classical I rather than the medieval J. But the Duke's rendition was faithful to both the meter and the meaning. Silence. Complete, absolute silence. Edward's face had gone red. His companions were staring at me with expressions that ranged from shock to outrage. And the Duke was looking at me as if he had never seen me before, as if I had materialized out of thin air and spoken to him in tongues. I realized with a sickening lurch what I had done. I had corrected a guest. I had displayed knowledge that no maid should possess. I had shattered the careful illusion I had spent years constructing, and there was no putting the pieces back together. I curtsied, my legs trembling. "I apologize for speaking out of turn," I said. "I will take my leave." I did not wait for permission. I turned and walked toward the door, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain they could all hear it. I expected to be stopped. I expected to be shouted at, dismissed on the spot, thrown out into the cold rain with nothing but the clothes on my back. But no one stopped me. No one said a word. And as I slipped through the door and into the corridor beyond, I allowed myself one small, foolish hope that perhaps, this would be the end of it. I was wrong. The summons came the following morning. Mrs. Blackwood found me in the linen closet, my arms full of freshly pressed sheets, and her expression told me everything I needed to know. "The Duke wishes to see you in the library," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Immediately." "Yes, ma'am." I set down the linens with hands that shook only slightly. I smoothed my apron, tucked a stray strand of hair behind my ear, and walked to my execution with all the dignity I could muster. The library was quiet when I entered, the fire from the night before reduced to glowing embers. The Duke stood by the window, as he had the first time I saw him, his back to the door, his silhouette framed by pale morning light. He did not turn when he heard me enter. "Close the door," he said. I obeyed, and the soft click of the latch seemed to echo in the vast room like a death knell. For a long moment, he said nothing. He simply stood there, staring out at the rain-soaked gardens, and I stood by the door, waiting for the blow to fall. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost curious. "Where did you learn Latin?" I considered lying. I considered telling him that I had overheard the phrase somewhere, that I had memorized it without understanding it, that it had been a lucky guess. But I was tired of lying. I was tired of pretending to be less than I was, and if I was going to be dismissed anyway, I might as well be dismissed for the truth. "My father taught me," I said. "He was a professor of classical languages at Cambridge. He died 3 years ago, and I had no means of supporting myself, so I became a maid." The Duke turned then, and for the first time I saw something other than coldness in his eyes. It was surprise, yes, but also something else, something that looked almost like respect. "A professor's daughter," he said slowly. "Scrubbing floors in my house? A woman must eat, Your Grace, and women of education without fortune have few options available to them." He was silent for a long moment, studying me with that penetrating gaze that seemed to see through all my carefully constructed defenses. "What is your name?" he asked. "Your real name." "Eleanor Ashford, Your Grace." I have never lied about that, But you lied about your father. You told me he was a school teacher. A lie of degree, not of kind. He was a teacher. I simply failed to mention the level at which he taught. The corner of his mouth twitched just slightly, and I realized with a start that he was fighting a smile. It transformed his face, softening the hard lines, making him look younger, more human. You corrected my guest's Latin, he said, in front of everyone. Do you have any idea how furious Edward was? I clasped my hands before me, bracing myself. I apologize, Your Grace. I spoke out of turn. I understand if you wish to dismiss me. Dismiss you? He laughed then, a short, surprised sound that seemed to catch even him off guard. Miss Ashford, I have not been so entertained in years. Edward Blackwell has been insufferable since our days at Oxford, always convinced that he is the most intelligent man in any room. To watch a maid, a woman he believed to be illiterate, correct his Latin with such precision and such poise, it was the most satisfying moment of my entire week. I stared at him, unable to comprehend what I was hearing. You are not angry? I am many things, Miss Ashford. Curious, certainly. Intrigued, absolutely. But angry. No. He moved away from the window, walking slowly toward his desk, his fingers trailing along the spines of the books that lined the walls. Tell me, what else did your father teach you? I hesitated, uncertain whether this was a trap. But something in his manner, a genuine curiosity that I had not expected, encouraged me to speak. Latin, Greek, French, I said. Some Italian and German. Literature, philosophy, history. He believed that a mind should know no boundaries. And do you agree with him? I do, Your Grace, though I have learned that the world often disagrees. He nodded slowly, as if I had confirmed something he already suspected. I have a proposition for you, Miss Ashford. My heart stuttered. A proposition. The word carried weight, implications that made my stomach clench with sudden fear. I had heard stories of aristocrats who made propositions to their maids, propositions that had nothing to do with respect and everything to do with power. Your Grace, I began, but he held up a hand. Not that kind of proposition, he said, and there was a weariness in his voice that surprised me. I am not that kind of man. He sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. I have a library of over 10,000 volumes, Miss Ashford. Many of them rare, many of them in languages that I read imperfectly. I have been searching for a librarian, someone who could catalog my collection, translate certain texts, assist me in my research. But finding someone with the necessary qualifications who is also willing to live in the countryside of Yorkshire has proven difficult. He looked at me directly. You have the qualifications. You are already here. The position would come with a significant increase in wages and a private room in the East Wing. You would no longer be required to perform the duties of a maid. I stood frozen, unable to believe what I was hearing. He was offering me a lifeline, a way out of the drudgery that had consumed my life for the past 3 years. He was offering me books, languages, intellectual work. He was offering me a chance to be myself again. But I was not naive. I knew how the world worked. I knew that a young woman alone with a duke, even in a library, would be subject to gossip, to scandal, to assumptions that could ruin whatever remained of my reputation. Your Grace, I said carefully, I am honored by the offer. Truly. But surely you must see how such an arrangement would appear. A woman in my position, working closely with a man in yours. The servants will talk. Society will talk. Let them talk, he said, and there was a bitterness in his voice that caught me off guard. They have been talking about me for years. The widower who loved his wife so much that he locked himself away from the world. The duke who refuses to remarry, who refuses to produce an heir, who refuses to play the games that society demands. They will talk regardless of what I do or do not do, and I have long since stopped caring. He moved toward me, stopping at a respectful distance, and for the first time, I saw the loneliness beneath his cold exterior. It was there in the lines around his eyes, in the slight slump of his shoulders, in the way he held himself apart even as he reached out. "I am not asking for your affection, Miss Ashford," he said quietly. "I am not asking for anything improper. I am merely asking for your mind. I have not had a proper intellectual conversation in years. My books are my only companions, and they do not answer back." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer. "But you do. You answered back last night, and for the first time in longer than I can remember, I felt something other than bored. I should have said no. Every instinct for self-preservation that I had developed over the past 3 years screamed at me to refuse, to take the safe path, to remain invisible. But there was another voice in my head, my father's voice, reminding me that a life of safety was not always a life worth living. "If I accept," I said slowly, "I have conditions." His eyebrows rose. "Conditions. I will be treated as a scholar, not a servant. I will have access to the library at all hours. I will be addressed as Miss Ashford, not as a maid. And if, at any point, I feel that the arrangement is no longer appropriate, I will be free to leave with a letter of reference and 3 months' wages." He stared at me for a long moment and then, unexpectedly, he smiled. A real smile, one that reached his eyes and transformed his entire face. "You drive a hard bargain, Miss Ashford. I learned from my father, Your Grace. He always said that a woman who does not advocate for herself should not expect others to do so on her behalf. Your father sounds like a wise man." "He was," I said, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to feel the grief that I had buried so deep. He was the wisest man I ever knew. The Duke nodded slowly, and something passed between us in that moment, a recognition of shared loss, of loneliness, of the weight of carrying on when everything you loved had been taken from you. "Then we have an agreement," he said. "Welcome to Ashworth Manor, Miss Ashford. The library is yours." And so began my new life. The first few weeks were strange and tentative, like learning to walk again after a long illness. I moved my meager belongings from the servants' quarters to a small but comfortable room in the East Wing, a room with a window that overlooked the gardens and a fireplace that kept the chill at bay. Mrs. Blackwood accepted the change in my status with a raised eyebrow, but no comment. And the other servants treated me with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. I was no longer one of them, but I was not quite one of the family either. I existed in a strange liminal space, belonging nowhere and everywhere at once. The library became my sanctuary. It was a vast 2-story room with walls lined floor to ceiling with books, their spines a rainbow of leather and cloth and gilt. A rolling ladder allowed access to the upper shelves, and a massive desk dominated the center of the room, its surface covered with papers and inkwells and the remnants of the Duke's solitary studies. There were comfortable chairs by the fire, a window seat cushioned in faded velvet, and a sense of quiet that seemed to absorb all sound and hold it tenderly. I would spend hours in that room, ostensibly cleaning, but in truth simply breathing in the scent of old paper and leather, letting the presence of so many words wash over me like a balm. The library at Cambridge, where my father had spent his days, had smelled exactly like this, a mixture of dust and ink and the particular mustiness that comes from centuries of accumulated knowledge. Being surrounded by books again felt like coming home, even if I was only there to dust them. The collection itself was extraordinary. Previous Dukes of Ashworth had been avid collectors, acquiring volumes from all over Europe and beyond. I found first editions of Milton and Dryden, their pages yellowed, but their words eternal. I found illuminated manuscripts from medieval monasteries, their gold leaf still gleaming faintly in the candlelight. I found scientific treatises and philosophical arguments, poetry and prose, histories and fictions, all jumbled together with no apparent system of organization. It was chaos, beautiful and overwhelming, and I loved it. Sometimes, when I was certain no one was watching, I would pull a book from the shelf and read a few pages, just to feel the words moving through my mind again. I read Seneca's letters and Marcus Aurelius's meditations. I read the love poetry of Catullus, blushing at some of the more explicit verses. I read Dante in the original Italian, my father's voice in my ear guiding me through the terza rima. Each stolen moment felt like a small act of rebellion, a reminder that I was still the woman my father had raised, even if the world no longer saw me that way. I began my work by cataloging the collection, a task that would take months, if not years. The Duke's ancestors had accumulated books haphazardly, with no regard for organization or preservation. First editions sat beside cheap reprints. Medieval manuscripts gathered dust next to modern novels. I found treasures hidden in forgotten corners, a handwritten copy of a Shakespearean sonnet, a marginalia-filled edition of Newton's Principia, a collection of love letters tucked between the pages of a French romance. Each discovery felt like a gift, a secret whispered across centuries. The Duke visited the library every afternoon, usually arriving around 2 o'clock and staying until dinner. At first, we worked in silence, each absorbed in our own tasks. He would read at his desk while I climbed the ladder to catalog the upper shelves, and the only sounds were the turning of pages and the soft scratch of my pen on paper. But gradually, imperceptibly, the silence began to give way to conversation. It started with questions about the books. He would ask me about a Greek text he was struggling with, and I would offer a translation. I would find a reference I did not understand, and he would explain its historical context. We debated the merits of Plato versus Aristotle, his preference for the latter's systematic approach clashing with my love of the former's poetic dialogues. We disagreed about the best translation of the Iliad, he favoring Pope's elegant couplets, while I argued for a more literal rendering that preserved Homer's original rhythms. We discovered a shared love of Ovid, and a mutual disdain for the Roman historians who prioritized politics over poetry. One afternoon, we spent 3 hours discussing the symposium, Plato's dialogue on the nature of love. Theodore read aloud from the Greek, his pronunciation better than I had expected from someone who claimed to have learned the language from books rather than tutors, and I offered my own interpretations of the more difficult passages. We debated whether Socrates' description of love as a ladder, ascending from physical beauty to the beauty of the soul, and ultimately to the form of beauty itself, was genuinely instructive, or merely an intellectualization of something that resisted such neat categorization. I believe Socrates is correct, Theodore said, setting down the book and gazing into the fire. Love should elevate us, should it not? Should make us better than we are. Perhaps, I replied carefully, aware that we were treading on dangerous ground. But I think Aristophanes' speech is the more beautiful one, the idea that we are all halves of a whole, searching for the person who completes us. That is a conception of love that speaks to something deeper than philosophy. You are a romantic, Miss Ashford, he said, and there was something in his voice that I could not quite identify. I am a realist who wishes she could be a romantic, I said. There is a difference. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I felt the weight of his attention like a physical thing. Is there? He asked softly. I did not answer. I could not. To answer would be to reveal too much, and I had already revealed far more than was safe. The days grew shorter as autumn deepened into winter. Frost crept across the windows each morning, and the fires in every room burned higher and longer as the cold seeped into the ancient stones of the manor. I found myself grateful for the library's warmth, grateful for the hours I could spend there wrapped in my shawl, surrounded by books, and by Theodore's quiet presence. We developed rituals, as people who spend time together inevitably do. He would bring tea in the afternoons, a pot of strong Darjeeling that we shared without formality, passing the cup back and forth as we discussed whatever text had captured our attention. I would read aloud to him sometimes, when his eyes grew tired from hours of close work, my voice filling the room with the words of poets and philosophers long dead. He would listen with his eyes closed, his face relaxed in a way it never was when he thought anyone was watching. I learned the contours of his mind during those weeks. I learned that he was brilliant but undisciplined, his thoughts leaping from subject to subject in ways that could be exhilarating or exhausting depending on one's perspective. I learned that he had a dry wit that emerged only when he was comfortable, that he laughed rarely but genuinely, that he could be surprisingly tender when discussing things that mattered to him. I learned that he still loved Catherine, that he probably always would, but that his grief was no longer the open wound it had once been. It had become a scar, visible but healed, a part of him rather than the whole. And I learned, slowly and against my will, that I was falling in love with him. "You have strong opinions, Miss Ashford," he said one afternoon, a note of amusement in his voice. I had just finished a passionate defense of Sappho's fragments against his claim that incomplete works could not be properly appreciated. "I have been told that before, Your Grace," I replied, usually as a criticism. It was not meant as one. He set down his book and looked at me with that penetrating gaze that still made my heart race, though I was learning to hide it. I have spent years surrounded by people who agree with everything I say. It is refreshing to encounter someone who does not. I curtsied, a hint of irony in the gesture. "I aim to be refreshing, Your Grace." He laughed, that short, surprised sound that I was beginning to hear more often. "And you succeed, Miss Ashford. You succeed." As the weeks passed, I began to see the man behind the mask. Theodore, as I had begun to think of him in the privacy of my own mind, was not cold by nature. He was cold by necessity, by the armor he had built around himself to survive the loss of his wife and the expectations of a society that demanded he move on before he was ready. When he forgot to guard himself, when he became absorbed in a text or a debate, the warmth in him emerged like sunlight breaking through clouds. He was funny, in a dry, understated way. He was curious about everything, from the habits of insects to the philosophy of distant lands. And he was kind, in ways he did not seem to recognize himself. A word of thanks to a servant, an extra blanket sent to the stables on a cold night, a quiet instruction that my wages were to be increased without my knowledge. But there were also shadows. There were days when he did not come to the library at all, when Mrs. Blackwood told me quietly that he was indisposed and I should work alone. There were moments when I caught him staring at nothing, his face a mask of grief so profound that I had to look away. And there was a portrait in the hallway outside his chambers, a portrait of a woman with golden hair and laughing eyes. And I knew without being told that this was Catherine, his lost wife, the ghost that still haunted these halls. I did not ask about her. It was not my place. And yet, her presence was everywhere, in the books she had chosen for the library, in the flowers that were still placed in her favorite vase, in the way the Duke sometimes paused in the middle of a sentence, as if listening for a voice that would never answer. I told myself that my growing feelings for him were nothing, a foolish infatuation, born of proximity and loneliness. I was grateful for the position he had given me, grateful for the intellectual companionship, grateful for the chance to be something more than a drudge. But gratitude was not love. And even if it were, love between a duke and a professor's daughter was impossible. He was a world above me, separated by birth and fortune and the unbreakable rules of society. To hope for anything more was to court heartbreak, and I had already known enough heartbreak to last a lifetime. So I buried my feelings deep, as I had buried so many things over the years. I focused on my work. I cataloged his books. I translated his texts. And if my heart beat faster when he entered the room, if my breath caught when our hands accidentally touched, if I dreamed of him in ways that made me blush in the morning light, well, those were my secrets to keep. The trouble with secrets is that they have a way of revealing themselves. It was a winter evening, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes the fire seem like the only living thing in the world. The Duke and I had been working late, debating a particularly thorny passage in Lucretius, and the hours had slipped away unnoticed. When I finally looked up, the candles had burned low, and the clock on the mantel showed nearly midnight. "I should retire, Your Grace," I said, rising from my chair. "It is late." He looked up from his book, and there was something in his expression that I had not seen before. A vulnerability, a hesitation, as if he were wrestling with words he was not sure he should speak. "Stay," he said. "Please. Just for a moment." I should have said no. I should have curtsied and left, preserved the proper boundaries that existed between us. But something in his voice held me, a loneliness so deep that it echoed my own. I sat back down. For a long moment he was silent. The fire crackled softly, and somewhere in the house, a clock chimed the hour. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "Do you ever wonder," he said, "what your life might have been like if things had been different? Every day, Your Grace." He nodded slowly, as if I had confirmed something he already knew. I was 24 when I married Catherine. Young, foolish, convinced that love conquered all. He smiled, but it was a sad smile, heavy with memory. She was everything I was not. Warm where I was cold, open where I was guarded. She made me laugh. She made me believe that perhaps the world was not as harsh as I had always thought. "She sounds wonderful," I said softly. She was. He looked down at his hands, clasped loosely in his lap. "She died of a fever, 2 weeks after our first anniversary. There was nothing anyone could do. I held her hand and watched the life leave her eyes, and when it was over, I did not know how to go on." "I am sorry," I said, and the words felt inadequate, as all words do in the face of grief. He looked up at me then, and for the first time, I saw tears in his eyes. The cold, guarded Duke who never showed emotion was crying, and the sight broke something open in my chest. "I locked myself away after she died," he said. "I told myself I would never love anyone again. I told myself that the pain was too great, that I could not survive it a second time. And for years, I believed it. For years, I was content to live in my books, in my memories, in the tomb I had built around my own heart. But then," he said, and his eyes met mine with an intensity that stole my breath, "you corrected my Latin." I could not speak. I could not breathe. I could only sit there, frozen, as the world tilted on its axis. "You corrected my Latin, and you looked at me without fear. You spoke to me as if I were a man, not a title. You challenged me and frustrated me and made me laugh for the first time in years. And I found myself, against all reason, against all expectation, wanting to know you, wanting to be near you, wanting things I had sworn I would never want again." "Your Grace," I began, but he held up a hand. "Theodore," he said. "Please. Just for tonight. Can I be Theodore?" I swallowed hard, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain he could hear it. "Theodore." He smiled, and it was a real smile, the kind that reached his eyes and softened all the hard lines of his face. "I know that what I am about to say is improper," he said. "I know that I am a duke and you are, in the eyes of society, far beneath me. I know that there will be scandal and whispers and consequences that neither of us can fully predict. But I have spent too many years being proper, Eleanor. I have spent too many years letting society dictate the boundaries of my heart. And I find that I am tired of it. I am tired of being alone. I am tired of pretending that I do not feel what I feel." He rose from his chair and crossed the room to where I sat, kneeling before me so that our eyes were level. "I love you," he said. "I love your mind and your spirit, and the way you refuse to be invisible. I love the way you look at a book like it holds the secrets of the universe. I love that you corrected my guest's Latin without a moment's hesitation, even knowing it might cost you everything. I love you, Eleanor Ashford, and I do not care if the whole world thinks I am mad." I was crying. I had not even realized it until I felt the tears on my cheeks, hot and unexpected. All the years of loneliness, all the nights I had spent wondering if anyone would ever see me, truly see me, again. All the masks I had worn, the parts I had played, the pieces of myself I had hidden away because the world had no place for them. And now this man, this impossible man, was looking at me as if I were the most precious thing he had ever seen. "This is impossible," I whispered. You know that. You are a duke. I am nobody. You are not nobody, he said fiercely. You are the most extraordinary person I have ever met, and I do not care about possibility. I care about you. But society, I protested, even as my heart strained toward him. Your family, your position. I have nothing to offer you but scandal. Society can hang itself for all I care, he said, and there was a passion in his voice that I had never heard before. I have played by society's rules my entire life. I married the woman they chose for me. I attended the events they expected of me. I performed the duties they demanded of me. And what did it get me? A year of happiness followed by decades of grief and emptiness. He shook his head, his jaw tight. No. I am done letting others dictate the terms of my existence. If loving you is scandalous, then let me be scandalous. If wanting you is improper, then let me be improper. I would rather live one day as myself than 1,000 years as the man they want me to be. He reached up and cupped my face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away my tears. Tell me you do not feel the same, he said. Tell me. And I will never speak of this again. I will find you a position in another household. I will give you whatever references you need, and I will spend the rest of my life regretting this moment. But if you feel even a fraction of what I feel, Eleanor, if there is any chance at all, then please, please do not walk away from me. I looked into his eyes, gray as winter storms, and I saw everything. His fear, his hope, his love, laid bare before me like an offering. And I knew, with a certainty that transcended logic and reason and all the rules that society had tried to teach me, that I loved him too. I love you, I said. I have loved you for weeks, perhaps longer. I have told myself it was impossible, that I was foolish, that I would only be hurt. But I love you, Theodore. I love you. He kissed me then, softly at first, tentatively, as if he were afraid I might disappear. And then, when I did not disappear, when I kissed him back with all the longing I had been hiding, the kiss deepened into something more. Something fierce and desperate and full of all the words we had not yet said. When we finally pulled apart, breathless and trembling, he rested his forehead against mine. I will marry you, he said. I do not care what anyone says. I will marry you, Eleanor Ashford, if you will have me. I laughed, a sound caught between joy and disbelief. You are asking a maid to become a duchess. I am asking the woman I love to become my wife. He smiled, and there was a lightness in his face that I had never seen before. There is a difference. I kissed him again, because I could, because he was asking me to spend the rest of my life doing exactly that. Yes, I said. Yes, I will marry you. The announcement sent shockwaves through the household and beyond. Mrs. Blackwood, to her credit, accepted the news with nothing more than a raised eyebrow and a quiet observation that she had suspected something of the sort. I have seen the way he looks at you, she said, her voice carefully neutral. And I have seen the way you look at him. I am not blind, Miss Ashford. She paused. Or should I say, Your Grace? The title felt strange on my tongue when I tried to imagine it applied to myself. Please, I said. It is still just Eleanor, at least until the wedding. She nodded, a ghost of a smile crossing her severe features. As you wish. Eleanor. The other servants were less restrained. I heard whispers and saw looks, some curious, some hostile, some grudgingly admiring. Lily, the kitchen maid who had first told me the story of Catherine's death, found me in the corridor one evening and grabbed my hands with an enthusiasm that bordered on painful. Is it true? She demanded. Are you really going to be a duchess? It appears so, I said, unable to suppress my own smile. But that is wonderful, she exclaimed. One of us, rising so high. It is like something out of a fairy story. I was not certain that my story qualified as a fairy tale, but I appreciated her excitement. It helped in those early days to have at least one person who was unreservedly happy for me. Not everyone was so kind. I heard the whispers, saw the sidelong glances. Fortune hunter, some said. Scheming minx, said others. She must have done something to bewitch him, one footman muttered to another within my hearing, not realizing that I was just around the corner. No man in his right mind would marry so far beneath him. I forced myself to ignore them. I had survived worse than whispers. I had survived the loss of everything I loved, the destruction of my entire world. A few envious servants could not touch me. The news spread through Yorkshire like wildfire, and from there to London, where it became the scandal of the season. The gossip columns, those arbiters of social acceptance, had a field day with the story. The Duke of Ashworth was marrying his librarian, they crowed. The Duke of Ashworth was marrying his former maid. The Duke of Ashworth had lost his mind, clearly, because no sane man would throw away generations of breeding and propriety for a woman who had once scrubbed his floors. Theodore read the articles aloud to me, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Listen to this, he said one morning over breakfast, brandishing a newspaper like a weapon. According to the Tatler, you are either a cunning seductress who has manipulated me for my fortune, or a tragic victim who has been coerced into a degrading arrangement. He looked up at me, one eyebrow raised. Which do you prefer? Can I not be both? I asked innocently. A cunning, tragic victim who has manipulated you into coercing me? He laughed, the sound echoing in the breakfast room. I knew there was a reason I loved you. I set down my teacup and looked at him seriously. Does it bother you? I asked. The gossip? The scandal? He considered the question carefully before answering. It would be dishonest to say it does not affect me at all, he admitted. I was raised to care about such things, and old habits die hard. But when I weigh the cost of their disapproval against the reward of your company, he reached across the table and took my hand. The calculation is not even close. I squeezed his fingers, feeling the warmth of his skin against mine. You are a strange man, Theodore Ashworth. I prefer the term unconventional, he said. It sounds more dignified. The Duke of Ashworth was marrying his librarian, a woman of no family, no fortune, no connections. A woman who had been, until recently, scrubbing floors in his own house. It was outrageous. It was unprecedented. It was the most romantic thing anyone had ever heard, depending on who was telling the story. Theodore's friends reacted with varying degrees of shock. Edward Blackwell, the guest whose Latin I had corrected, never spoke to him again. Others were more understanding, if cautious. A few, surprisingly, offered their genuine congratulations. One elderly baron, a friend of Theodore's late father, sent a letter that I still treasure to this day. He wrote that he had known many duchesses in his long life, and that most of them had been tiresome, empty-headed women who cared for nothing but fashion and gossip. A duchess who can quote Virgil, he wrote, is exactly what this family needs. But not everyone was so kind. Theodore's mother, the Dowager Duchess, arrived at Ashworth Manor 2 weeks after the engagement was announced, her face set in lines of cold fury. I had heard of Lady Ashworth, of course. The servants spoke of her in whispers, describing a woman of iron will and impeccable breeding who had ruled this household for decades before Theodore's marriage to Catherine. She had retired to the dower house after her son's wedding, but she still wielded considerable influence in society, and her disapproval could ruin even the best-laid plans. She swept into the library where Theodore and I were working, not bothering to knock, her silk skirts rustling with outrage. I received your letter, she said to Theodore, her voice dripping with disdain. I came as soon as I could, hoping that it was some kind of joke. Tell me, please, that you have not actually proposed marriage to a servant. Theodore rose from his chair, his expression carefully neutral. Mother, allow me to introduce Miss Eleanor Ashford, my fiancée. Lady Ashworth's gaze swept over me, and I felt myself being catalogued and dismissed in a single glance. I know who she is, she said. The girl who corrected Edward Blackwell's Latin. The entire county is talking about it. She turned back to Theodore. Have you lost your mind? Have you forgotten everything you owe to this family? To our name? To the memory of your father? I owe nothing to a name. Theodore said, and his voice was calm but unyielding. I owe everything to my own happiness, which has been in short supply these past years. Eleanor makes me happy. I am going to marry her. And if the family name suffers for it, then perhaps the family name was not worth as much as we believed. Lady Ashworth drew herself up to her full height. Your father would be ashamed of you. My father married for duty and was miserable for 30 years. I will not make the same mistake. The room crackled with tension. I stood frozen, uncertain whether to speak or to remain silent, uncertain what role I was supposed to play in this drama. It was Lady Ashworth who finally broke the standoff. She turned to me, her eyes cold as ice. You, she said, do you have any idea what you are doing? Do you have any conception of what it means to be a duchess? The expectations, the responsibilities, the constant scrutiny? You will be mocked, girl. You will be whispered about in every drawing room in England. You will never be accepted, no matter how many books you have read or how perfectly you conjugate your Latin verbs. You will be a laughingstock, and you will drag my son down with you. I met her gaze without flinching. I know exactly what I am doing, my lady, and I know exactly what I am risking. But I also know that your son has been alone for too long, locked away in this house with nothing but his grief for company. I cannot give him a noble bloodline or a political alliance, but I can give him companionship. I can give him someone who sees him as a man rather than a title. And if that is not enough for society, then perhaps society's standards need to be re-examined. Lady Ashworth stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something flicker in her eyes. Surprise, perhaps? Or grudging respect. You have spirit, she said finally. I will give you that. I have more than spirit, my lady. I have love. She turned back to Theodore. If you do this, there will be consequences. I cannot protect you from them. I am not asking for your protection, mother. I am asking for your blessing. But if you cannot give it, I will marry her anyway. The silence stretched between them, heavy with years of unspoken words and unhealed wounds. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, Lady Ashworth's shoulders softened. You are your father's son, she said, stubborn to the last. She sighed, a sound that held more weariness than anger. Very well. If you are determined to do this, then do it properly. I will not have it said that my son's wedding was a hole-in-corner affair. We will have a ceremony befitting a duke, and we will present your bride to society as if she had been born to it. If we are going to weather a scandal, we might as well do it with style. She swept out of the room without another word, leaving Theodore and me staring after her in stunned silence. Was that, I said slowly, her blessing? Theodore let out a breath, something between a laugh and a sob. I believe it was. He crossed the room and took my hands in his. Are you all right? I know she can be intimidating. I smiled, still shaking slightly from the encounter. She is formidable, but I did not survive 3 years as a servant to be frightened by a dowager duchess. He kissed my forehead, a gesture so tender it made my heart ache. My brave, brilliant Eleanor. What did I ever do to deserve you? You corrected my Latin, I said. The rest was inevitable. The wedding took place on a spring morning, when the gardens of Ashworth Manor were ablaze with roses and the air smelled of possibility. True to her word, Lady Ashworth had organized an event befitting a duke, with a guest list that read like a who's who of English aristocracy. If she could not prevent the scandal, she had decided to own it, presenting me to society with such confidence and authority that anyone who dared to whisper did so quietly and quickly fell silent. The preparations had taken months. There were dress fittings and menu selections, guest lists to approve, and seating arrangements to negotiate. Lady Ashworth oversaw every detail with military precision, brooking no argument and accepting no excuses. She was determined, she told me, that no one would be able to say the wedding was anything less than perfect. I will not have it said that my son married in shame, she declared during one of our many planning sessions. We will give them a spectacle they cannot criticize. And you? She fixed me with her piercing gaze. will conduct yourself with such grace and dignity that they will have no choice but to accept you." "I will do my best, my lady," I said. "You will do better than your best," she replied. "You will be flawless." I wore a gown of ivory silk, simple but elegant, chosen by Lady Ashworth herself after hours of debate with the modiste from London she had summoned specifically for the occasion. "She has good bones," I had overheard her telling the modiste. "We do not need to bury her in lace. Let the gown speak for itself." It was perhaps the kindest thing she had ever said about me, and I treasured it. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, as if even the weather had decided to cooperate with Lady Ashworth's plans. I woke before sunrise, my stomach churning with a mixture of excitement and terror, and spent an hour simply staring at the ceiling, trying to comprehend that this day had actually arrived. My maid, a girl named Sarah who had been assigned to me since the engagement, helped me dress with trembling hands. She was barely 18, sweet-natured and easily flustered, and I suspected she was more nervous than I was. "You look beautiful, miss," she breathed as she fastened the last button. "Like a princess." I looked at my reflection in the mirror and saw a stranger looking back. The gown transformed me, softening my sharp edges and lending me an elegance I had never possessed. My hair had been piled atop my head in an elaborate arrangement of curls and braids, secured with pearl-studded pins that had belonged to Catherine. Lady Ashworth had insisted on this detail, and though I had initially protested, I understood now what she intended. She was not erasing Catherine's memory. She was incorporating it. She was making me part of the family's history rather than an intruder upon it. Theodore waited for me at the altar, and when I walked toward him on the arm of the elderly baron who had written me that kind letter, I saw tears in his eyes. He was not wearing his mask, not today. Today, he was simply Theodore, the man I loved, the man who loved me. He wore a coat of deep blue velvet and a cravat of pristine white, and he had never looked more handsome. "You are beautiful," he murmured as I took my place beside him. "I cannot believe you are real." "I am very real," I whispered back, "and very much in love with you." The ceremony was a blur of words and music and the scent of flowers. I remember saying "I do," my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands. I remember feeling the cool weight of the ring on my finger, a band of gold set with a single sapphire that Theodore had chosen himself. I remember Theodore's kiss, soft and reverent, sealing our vows before God and all of English society. I also remember the faces of the guests, their expressions ranging from genuine happiness to barely concealed shock. I remember Lady Ashworth, seated in the front pew, her face unreadable but her eyes suspiciously bright. I remember the Baron, who dabbed at his eyes with a handkerchief and whispered that my father would have been so proud. But most of all, I remember the feeling that swept through me as we walked back down the aisle together, husband and wife. It was not triumph, though there was perhaps a touch of that. It was not vindication, though I would be lying if I said I did not take some satisfaction in the faces of those who had looked down on me. It was something simpler and more profound. It was peace. For the first time in years, I felt that I belonged somewhere, not because of birth or fortune or the accidents of circumstance, but because someone had chosen me. Theodore had looked at me, had truly seen me, and had decided that I was worthy of love. And in that choice, I had found my home. The first years of our marriage were happy ones. We spent our days in the library, working side by side as we had always done, though now our debates were punctuated by kisses and our late-night discussions continued in the privacy of our chambers. Theodore began to emerge from his shell, accepting invitations he had declined for years, even hosting a few gatherings of his own. Society watched us with hawk-like attention, waiting for the cracks to appear, but we gave them nothing to criticize. We were partners, equals, two minds that had found their match. There were challenges, of course. There always are. I had to learn the 1,000 small rituals that governed aristocratic life. The complex dance of precedence and protocol that determined who sat where at dinner, who was greeted first at a reception, who could be acknowledged on the street, and who must be cut. Lady Ashworth was my teacher in these matters, drilling me on etiquette with the same rigor my father had once applied to Latin declensions. She was not gentle, but she was thorough, and by the end of my first year as Duchess, I could navigate a London ballroom without committing any unforgivable errors. I also had to learn to manage a great household, a task far more complicated than I had anticipated. As a maid, I had seen only a fraction of what went into keeping an estate like Ashworth Manor running. Now I was responsible for dozens of servants, thousands of pounds in annual expenses, and the complex logistics of maintaining multiple residences, gardens, farms, and tenants. Mrs. Blackwood was invaluable in those early days, patiently explaining the systems and hierarchies that kept everything functioning, never once reminding me that I had once been one of the maids she managed. And then there were the social battles. The Ton had not forgotten my origins, and there were those who never would. I learned to recognize the signs of snubbing, the turned backs and whispered conversations, the invitations that mysteriously failed to arrive. I learned to hold my head high regardless, to smile graciously at insults thinly veiled as compliments, to pretend not to notice when a room fell silent at my entrance. Theodore was my shield in those early years. He stood beside me at every event, his presence a silent challenge to anyone who might think of treating me with disrespect. He cut dead anyone who insulted me openly, regardless of their rank or fortune. And when I came home exhausted and discouraged, he held me in his arms and reminded me that none of it mattered, that the only opinion worth caring about was his. "You are worth 1,000 of them," he would say, his voice fierce with conviction. "They are jealous because you have something they can never buy, a mind that is truly your own." Slowly, grudgingly, society began to accept me. Part of it was time. Scandals fade, new dramas arise, and the public memory is short. Part of it was Lady Ashworth's relentless campaign of respectability, her refusal to acknowledge that there was anything unusual about her daughter-in-law's background. But part of it, I believe, was simply that I refused to disappear. I attended every event to which I was invited and held my own at every gathering. I proved again and again that I was not the ignorant fortune hunter they had assumed me to be, and eventually, grudgingly, they had to concede that perhaps the Duke had not been entirely mad after all. Lady Ashworth remained formidable, but over time, her frostiness thawed into something approaching warmth. She took it upon herself to teach me the intricacies of managing a great household, and though her lessons were often delivered with cutting remarks, I came to understand that this was simply her way. She had spent her life navigating a world that punished weakness, and her sharpness was armor, just as Theodore's coldness had been. One evening, nearly 2 years after my wedding, she found me in the library, reading a letter that had just arrived. "You look troubled," she said, settling into the chair across from me with the easy authority of a woman who had spent decades commanding rooms. I set down the letter. It is from an old colleague of my father's. He is retiring from Cambridge and wishes to donate my father's papers to the university library. He wanted to know if I had any objections. Lady Ashworth raised an eyebrow. "And do you?" "I do not know." I paused, trying to find words for feelings I had never fully examined. My father's papers were all I had left of him, for a time. His notes, his translations, his marginalia. I carried them with me through every position I held, through every house where I was nothing more than another pair of hands. They were proof that I had once been something more. And now I am a duchess. I smiled, a little ruefully. "I have a library of my own. Perhaps it is time to let others benefit from his work." Lady Ashworth was silent for a moment. Then she said, "Your father would be proud of you. Not because you married a duke, though I am sure he would have appreciated the irony, but because you never let circumstances diminish you. That is a rare quality, Eleanor. I did not see it at first, but I see it now." It was the closest she had ever come to an apology for her initial hostility, and I understood it for the gift it was. "Thank you, my lady," I said. "That means more than you know." She waved a hand dismissively. "Yes, well, do not let it go to your head. And for heaven's sake, stop calling me my lady. We are family now. You may call me Mother or Victoria if you prefer, just not my lady. It makes me feel ancient." I laughed, genuine and surprised. "I shall endeavor to remember that, Victoria." "See that you do." She rose, smoothing her skirts. "Now, I believe your husband is looking for you. Something about a rare manuscript he has acquired. The man is insufferable about his books, but I suppose you already know that." "I do," I said, rising as well. "It is one of the many things I love about him." "Yes," she said, and there was a softness in her voice that I had never heard before. "I am beginning to see that." Theodore met me in the main hall, his eyes alight with the particular excitement that meant he had made a discovery. "Come with me," he said, taking my hand. "There is something I must show you." He led me through the corridors of Ashworth Manor, past the portraits of his ancestors and the windows that looked out over the moonlit gardens, until we reached a part of the house I had never been allowed to enter. It was the old wing, the one that had been closed off after Catherine's death, the one that held her chambers and the memories Theodore had not been ready to face. He paused before a heavy wooden door, his hand on the handle. "I have been meaning to do this for some time," he said quietly, "but I could not do it alone. Will you come with me?" I squeezed his hand. "Of course." He opened the door. The room beyond was beautiful, though dusty with disuse. It had clearly once been a sitting room, filled with comfortable furniture and feminine touches that spoke of its former occupant. Flowers had been painted on the walls, faded now but still visible, delicate roses and trailing vines that must have taken an artist months to complete. A pianoforte stood in the corner, its keys silent and still, and there were books scattered on every surface, novels and poetry collections that Catherine had clearly loved. I moved through the room slowly, taking it all in. There was a writing desk by the window, its surface still holding a dried-out inkwell and a few sheets of yellowed paper. A sewing basket sat beside one of the chairs, needles and thread still arranged neatly inside. A shawl had been draped over the back of a settee, its fabric faded by years of sunlight streaming through the windows. It was as if Catherine had simply stepped out of the room one afternoon and never returned. As if time had stopped the moment she died, preserving this space exactly as she had left it. "Catherine decorated this room herself," Theodore said, his voice thick with memory. "She said it was her sanctuary, the one place in this enormous house that was entirely her own. She would spend hours here, reading and writing letters and playing that pianoforte." He smiled, but it was a sad smile, heavy with loss. She was not very good at the pianoforte, to be honest, but she played with such enthusiasm that it did not matter. I looked around, seeing not the dust and the decay, but the love that had gone into every choice, every detail. The flowers on the walls were wild roses, I noticed, not the cultivated varieties that filled the formal gardens. The books were well thumbed and worn, clearly read many times over. The shawl was a practical wool, not the silk that a duchess might be expected to wear. "She sounds like a woman who knew her own mind," I said. "She was," Theodore agreed. "That was one of the things I loved most about her. She did not care what society expected of a duchess. She cared about what made her happy. She had wonderful taste," I said. "She did." He moved to the pianoforte, running his fingers lightly over the keys. "I had this room sealed after she died. I could not bear to see it, to be reminded of everything I had lost. But I realize now that I was not honoring her memory by hiding it away. I was hiding from my own grief." He turned to face me. "I want to open this room again," he said. "I want to restore it, make it part of our home. Not to forget Catherine, never that, but to remember her properly, to let her memory be a part of our life together, rather than a ghost that haunts us." I crossed the room and took his hands in mine. I think that is a beautiful idea, I said, and I think Catherine would have wanted that. He kissed me then, soft and slow, and when he pulled away, there were tears on both our faces. I loved her, he said. I will always love her. But I love you too, Eleanor. Differently, but no less. You have given me back my life, and you have given me mine, I said. We are even. He laughed, the sound echoing in the empty room, filling it with warmth. Then let us make this house a home, he said, together. And we did. Years passed, as years do, bringing with them the small joys and sorrows that make up a life. We restored Catherine's sitting room and made it a music room, filling it with the sounds of the pianoforte that I learned to play, badly at first, and then better. Theodore would sit in the corner chair that had once been Catherine's favorite and listen to me practice, his eyes closed, a peaceful expression on his face. Sometimes, when I played particularly well, he would join me at the instrument, and we would attempt duets, our fingers stumbling over each other on the keys, laughing at our own clumsiness. We expanded the library, acquiring rare volumes from across Europe. Theodore developed a particular interest in natural philosophy, and we spent one memorable summer attempting to replicate some of Newton's experiments in optics, filling the library with prisms and candles and getting in the way of the servants who were trying to dust. Another year, we became fascinated by the botanical works of Linnaeus, and Theodore commissioned a conservatory to be built on the south side of the house where we could grow exotic plants and study them at our leisure. We hosted salons where scholars and artists mingled with aristocrats, blurring the lines that society had tried so hard to draw. Theodore had connections to the Royal Society through his university days, and we began inviting naturalists and mathematicians to stay with us, men who cared nothing for social rank and everything for intellectual discourse. For the first time in my life, I was not the only woman in the room who could discuss philosophy and science, for some of these learned men brought their wives and daughters, women who had been educated as I had been, and who were hungry for the same kind of conversation. These gatherings became famous in their way. We called them our symposia, after Plato, and they attracted visitors from as far as Paris and Edinburgh. The ton whispered about them, of course, but the whispers had changed. We were no longer scandalous. We were eccentric, which was somehow more acceptable. The Duke and his unusual Duchess, with their books and their experiments, and their strange dinner parties where politics was forbidden and poetry was required. We traveled, too, in those years. We spent a spring in Rome, wandering among the ruins of the Forum and reading Cicero in the places where he had once walked. We visited Paris before the Revolution, attending the salons of the philosophes and debating Voltaire with men who had known him personally. We went to Greece, to see for ourselves the land that Homer had sung of, standing on the plains of Troy and reciting the Iliad to each other while the wind whipped around us. Each journey deepened our bond. There is something about traveling together, about sharing the discomforts and delights of foreign places, that strips away pretense and reveals the core of a relationship. Theodore was an ideal companion, curious about everything, patient with delays and mishaps, equally comfortable in a grand hotel and a humble inn. And I discovered in myself a capacity for adventure that I had never suspected, a willingness to embrace the unknown that my father would have applauded. It was in Florence, in a gallery filled with Renaissance masterpieces, that Theodore turned to me and said something I have never forgotten. "I was dead before I met you," he said. "I was going through the motions of living, but I was dead inside. You brought me back to life, Eleanor. You taught me how to see the world again." I took his hand, there in front of Botticelli's Primavera, and I felt my heart overflow with gratitude and love. "You did the same for me," I said. I had given up on happiness. I had accepted that my life would be small and quiet and lonely. You showed me that it could be so much more. He kissed me then, in that gallery, in front of the other visitors who probably thought we were mad. And perhaps we were. But it was a beautiful madness, a madness I would not have traded for all the sanity in the world. Victoria remained formidable until her final breath, passing peacefully in her sleep at the age of 82. At her funeral, I wept, not just for the woman she had been, but for the mother she had become to me, in her own sharp, exacting way. And through it all, Theodore and I remained what we had always been: partners, lovers, friends. We argued about philosophy and kissed during thunderstorms. We read to each other by candlelight and danced in the empty ballroom when no one was watching. We built a life that defied every expectation society had for us, and we were happy. It is evening now as I write this, the candles burning low in my study, the same study where Theodore first asked me about my father. He is across the hall in the library, no doubt absorbed in some ancient text, and soon I will join him. We will sit by the fire, as we have done for decades, and we will talk about nothing and everything. And when we are tired, we will climb the stairs together, hand in hand. I am an old woman now, my hair more silver than brown, my hands marked by time. But when I look in the mirror, I see not the lines and wrinkles, but the journey that brought me here. I see the grieving daughter who lost everything, the maid who scrubbed floors and dreamed of books, the woman who corrected a duke's Latin and found love in the most unexpected of places. I think of my father often, still. I think of the lessons he taught me, the languages he gave me, the belief he instilled in me that a mind should know no boundaries. He was right about that, as he was right about so many things. The world does draw boundaries, but we are not obligated to respect them. We can push against them, question them, ultimately transcend them. I have kept my father's spectacles and my mother's lock of hair all these years, stored in a small wooden box in my dressing room. Sometimes, when I am feeling nostalgic, I take them out and hold them in my hands, feeling the weight of memory and love. Theodore knows about these treasures. He has seen me with them on quiet evenings, and he has never asked me to explain. He understands, as only someone who has lost deeply can understand, that grief and love are not enemies but companions, traveling together through the years. The copy of Virgil's Aeneid that I smuggled out of my father's house so many years ago now sits in a place of honor in our library, encased in glass alongside first editions worth thousands of pounds. Theodore had a special case made for it, with a small brass plaque that reads simply, "The book that began it all." It is perhaps not the most valuable volume in our collection, but it is certainly the most precious to me. I have written other things over the years, translations and essays and letters to the scholarly journals that Theodore encouraged me to contribute to. But this account, this story of how a maid became a duchess, is different. It is personal in a way that my academic work has never been. It is a gift, I suppose, to whoever might read it someday, a testament to the power of love and the resilience of the human heart. Theodore pushed against the boundaries of his class and his grief. I pushed against the boundaries of my circumstances and my fear. And together, we created something beautiful. This is my story, written for anyone who has ever felt invisible, who has ever been told they are not enough, who has ever loved against all odds. It is a story about Latin and libraries, about loss and redemption, about the quiet courage of speaking up when the world expects you to remain silent. It is also, I suppose, a love story. But then, all the best stories are. Tomorrow, Theodore and I will celebrate our 40th anniversary. He has planned something. I can tell by the secretive gleam in his eye, the same gleam he had when he first asked me to be his librarian. I do not know what it is, and I do not need to. Whatever it is, we will face it together, as we have faced everything. When I was young, my father used to say that the truest measure of a life was not wealth or status, but the love you gave and received. By that measure, my life has been immeasurably rich. I have been loved by a good man, and I have loved him in return. I have found purpose and meaning in work that matters to me. I have built a home out of books and memories and the quiet moments that make up a marriage. What more could anyone ask? The fire is dying now, and I should join Theodore before he comes looking for me. He worries when I stay up too late writing. He says it is bad for my eyes. Though we both know he simply wants an excuse to bring me tea and sit beside me while I work. I will end this account where it began, with a correction. Edward Blackwell said that the Duke pronounced his Latin incorrectly, and I corrected him. But the truth is, it was I who was corrected, in a far more important way. I had believed that I was diminished by my circumstances, that I was less than I had been because I had lost my place in the world. Theodore showed me that I was wrong. He showed me that my value did not depend on my station, that love could cross the boundaries society erected, that a maid could become a duchess not by forgetting who she was, but by being exactly who she had always been. Forsan et haec olim meminis juvabit. Perhaps someday it will be pleasing to remember even these things. Virgil wrote those words about hardship, about the trials that shape us. But I prefer to apply them to joy. Perhaps someday, when I am gone and this account is all that remains, someone will read it and remember. Not me, specifically, but the truth that my story represents. That love is possible, that redemption is real, that even the most unlikely beginnings can lead to the most beautiful endings. That is my legacy. That is what I leave behind. And that, I think, is enough. I set down my pen and rise from my desk, my joints protesting slightly as they always do in the cold. Across the hall, I can hear the familiar sound of pages turning, the soft murmur of Theodore reading aloud to himself, a habit he has never broken. I smile, gathering my shawl around my shoulders, and make my way toward the library. He looks up as I enter, and his face transforms with that particular light that has never dimmed, not in 40 years. "There you are," he says. "I was beginning to think you had forgotten me." "Never," I reply, settling into the chair beside him. "I was writing. Your memoirs, something like that." He reaches for my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine as naturally as breathing. "Will you read it to me someday?" "Perhaps," I say. "When it is finished." He nods, content to wait as he has always been content to wait, trusting that I will share what I need to share when I am ready. "I love you," he says, the words worn smooth by decades of use but no less precious for it. "I love you too," I reply, "and I always will." Outside, the snow begins to fall, soft and silent, blanketing the world in white. Inside, the fire crackles, the books stand sentinel on their shelves, and two people who found each other against all odds sit together in the gathering dusk, their hands entwined, their hearts at peace. This is not an ending. It is a continuation. And that, perhaps, is the best kind of story there is,